play. And what we are really hoping in this panel, Alternative Modes of Play, is to have a conversation that centers around all the different ways that people engage with the tabletop games that they play with. So we thought that this group of people would be an excellent group for that conversation, and we're really, really excited that you've all come to join us today for the discussion. Just a reminder for everybody, all talks will be 15 minutes long. I will give you a 5-minute warning. I will give you a 1-minute warning, and then if you go on beyond that, I will actually come onto the screen and request that you wrap things up immediately. That said, let's jump into the panelists. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A, but our first panelist is, and please correct me if I pronounce your name wrong, is Percival Hornak, who's going to present their paper, Reclaiming Queer History, and Together We Write Private Cathedrals. So thank you for coming, Percival. Please take it away.
Amazing. Obligatory, can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm going to take that as a yes. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I am honored to be joining Generation Analog as a presenter this year instead of just an attendee. It's really exciting to be in community with all of you. I'm Percival Hornak. I use he, they, and Z pronouns. I recently completed an MFA in dramaturgy and certificate in women's gender and sexuality studies at UMass Amherst. I wrote my thesis on alternate reality games and how we invite audiences to be authors and collaborators in performance events. But today I'm talking about reclaiming queer history and Together We Write Private Cathedrals. Dominant discourse tends to narrate the emergence of queer and trans people as a recent event, a crisis that has to be addressed. And a natural response to this is to search history for evidence that we've always existed, that for this reason we have a right to be here. However, searching history for queer and trans figures that are legible is fraught by rampant erasure and exclusion from the archive, as well as really narrow definitions of what counts as queer and trans and how those categories have evolved over time. This limits what manifestations of queer and trans life are legible enough to be included in a historical record. Often queer people are written into history as friends, roommates, gals being pals. Dominant ways of doing history that have only recently begun to account for our existence will not suffice. It is not enough to add queer and trans people back into existing historical records. We need to find new ways of doing history altogether that are invested in queer and trans survival in the present, fueled by affective connections across time to figures and communities in the past. I would argue that games and play are a really invaluable part of disrupting dominant narrations of history and making space for new narrators. And my research explores how embodied and affective experiences like games and performance can put queer historiographic theorizing into practice. I posit that what we really want, more than a more accurate historical record, is a sense of community that stretches across time. This desire comes in part from historical harm that constitutes queer and trans communities in the present. I want to be careful to note that while I believe that having a relationship with history is really crucial for building community and pursuing queer futurity, approaching the work of doing history with the intention of assimilating the past into a narrative of progress or making it instructive for people in the present is also really fraught and difficult. It can be tempting to leave out events that were harmful or that make us sad to think about or that don't fit neatly into a story about how far we've come, but those things shaped our communities, whether we acknowledge it or not. Including these events in our history can help us grapple with the lingering effects of past harm to our community in the present. We owe it to those who came before us to relate to them in ways that go beyond making their lives instructive to how we live our own. So rather than simply adding figures back into history through archival research, I argue that we can use the act of play to place the power of narration in the hands of marginalized communities directly and create community among queer and trans players in the present. Specifically, I'm drawing on Miguel Sicart's definition of play and his argument that, quote, carnivalesque play takes control of the world and gives it to the players for them to explore, challenge, or subvert. It exists. It is part of the world it turns upside down. Through carnivalesque play, we express ourselves, taking over the world to laugh at it and make sense of it too. Play can help us appropriate the power to decide what gets recorded as history and who is allowed to make credible contributions to the archive. In this talk, I will delve specifically into Rufus Roswell's game, Together We Write Private Cathedrals. It is an epistolary game about two queer people in history in which players create the historical record of their love for one another. It is a game that gives us the power to narrate history for ourselves, which also builds the realities of censorship, homophobia, transphobia, and similar forces into its mechanics, thus acknowledging the role that these forces had in shaping our past. Through the act of writing letters, news stories, and other records of their characters' love, players in this game reclaim the power to narrate the past, and they form affective connections across the ages to figures in history, in pursuit of imagining what heteronormative discourse has erased or simply failed to see. Through placing the power of authorship directly in players' hands, this game disrupts the structures of power that have limited what versions of queer and trans life can appear in dominant narrations of history, if they appear at all. And by extension, it makes space for a wide variety of queer and trans embodiments. Further, Together We Write Private Cathedrals offers us a strong example of how we might use games and play as tools for queer historiographic projects and research. Roswell notes in the beginning of the manual for Private Cathedrals that people tend to reject queer readings of history on the basis that queerness and transness exist differently now than they did in the past, or because we have no way of knowing for sure that certain figures would self-identify in a way that we recognize now as queer or trans. Roswell argues that such excuses boil down to an argument that, quote, only the most explicit and definitive forms of queerness can be interpreted as valid, that the only stories of queerness that escaped censorship, homophobic historians, fascist regimes, colonialism, or 1,000 other forms of erasure are true stories, end quote. Folks making those arguments are engaging in a kind of survivorship bias, mistaking those who made it into the historical record as representative of all queer and trans life. Roswell's game embraces the fact that queerness has always existed without clear boundaries or definitions, and it challenges players to see themselves in history by considering not just what has been recorded, but also in accidents, errors, deviations, disparity. He notes, quote, to be queer and look for yourself in history is an exercise in reading what was left unsaid, in what was able to pass uncensored. It is an exercise in understanding the words people use for themselves and in making room for the imprecise, the ephemeral, the numinous. We cannot change the fact that the archive is incomplete and that queer and trans life have been largely erased from it. However, I would ask, what happens if we take the fact that we can't know for sure whether figures who are no longer alive were queer or trans as a jumping off point for play and imagination? What happens if we accept the partialness of our knowledge as a condition of possibility for building relationships with these figures? Carolyn Dinshaw's Getting Medieval takes up similar questions in its emphasis on making relations that are rooted in indeterminacy and positionality rather than direct identification. Akin to Donna Haraway's argument that the situatedness of our particular knowledges make it possible for us to join what we know with others and produce something greater than the sum of its parts, Dinshaw argues for a way of doing history that is focused on forming affective connections across time that become the basis for building identity and community in the present. It can be easy to feel discouraged by the fact that we've been left out of history or the record's not complete. But as Saidiya Hartman notes, quote, the necessity of trying to represent what we cannot, rather than leading to pessimism or despair, must be embraced as the impossibility that conditions our knowledge of the past and animates our desire for a liberated future. Together We Write Private Cathedrals is an epistolary game for 2 players meant to be played asynchronously. Together, you construct the historical record of your 2 characters' relationship by taking on the role of those characters, as well as friends, family, community, the press, etc. I've played it via snail mail, as well as in a shared Google Doc, but play can take place in a variety of other modes as well. To begin, you choose a time period and location, you name your characters, and you lay out the sort of bare bones of your shared story. Roswell emphasizes that you should let as much as possible evolve through gameplay rather than plotting things out in advance. Some games of Private Cathedrals I have played have been set on an 18th century pirate ship with characters inspired by Anne Bonny and Mary Read, with flashes forward to teenagers in the early 2000s who love pirates and are blogging about them, vampire bootleggers in 1920s Washington, D.C., and poets in New York in the late 1950s inspired by Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. The only requirements in terms of character creation are that they must be queer and they must be in love. However, Roswell leaves a lot of space for you to define what queer and in love mean. Gameplay happens in turns. Each turn you roll a die and you draw a card from a deck of 52 playing cards. The suit of the card you pull determines the type of document you will write, who's writing it and to whom. Beyond letters, you might also write news articles, memoir excerpts, transcripts of speeches, postcards, etc. The number and letter of the card you pull correspond to an oracle of prompts in the handbook, which I put on a slide here for you. And the die roll determines how safe you are to be explicit about your character's queerness and to what extent your love must stay between the lines of the letter that you're writing. I also have some examples that I'm going to show you of games that I've played of what the product of a turn might look like. First, this is a newspaper clipping that my friend CJ Linton made about an in-game event that I had written about in my previous letter. This is an entry that took the form of a Tumblr post for which I rolled a 1, so it needed to be stricken from the record. This is a letter and several accompanying half-written drafts that CJ wrote depicting his character's sort of turmoil over my character putting himself in danger to protect his lover. On the left here is a letter that I rolled a 1 on and subsequently burned. And on the right is a star map and letter that my friend Ray wrote that appeared in a Tumblr post by their character's descendant. Heather Love notes that, quote, for groups constituted by historical injury, the challenge is to engage with the past without being destroyed by it. This game addresses this challenge by giving us the power to narrate what happens, even though we don't have direct control over how public or private we can be. It acknowledges the injury, but it shifts the power of writing the archive of history into the hands of the players. The actual embodied experience of playing this game, at least for me and the friends I played it with, can be really emotional and really difficult, particularly when you read a letter from your partner and immediately you know how you would want to respond, but the card that you pull and the die roll that you get pushes you in a different direction. But there's also a surprising intimacy and vulnerability in the act of writing letters to your fellow player, particularly when there's often a lot of time between turns. The game's inclusion of community in the creation of its historical record is also really important. Often you're not writing directly to your lover, but to a friend or a family member, or you're recording something that your character plans to keep to themselves, like a diary entry. You build a sense of the world your characters live in alongside the story of their love. The game's emphasis is on the embodied experience of building this record rather than the record in and of itself, which is the sort of turn to queer historiography that I think is really useful and at play in this game. For myself and the friends that I played with, the game gave us an opportunity to revisit historical figures who resonate with us some way or feel so queer despite them being recorded in history as cisgender and heterosexual. We could imagine what would happen if their queerness was explicit and explore the conditions under which it gets obscured. While it does not do the direct work of writing queerness back into history, I would argue that Private Cathedrals does something more important, which is give individuals who play a taste of what it's like to have authorship of the historical record. I'm arguing for understanding this game as part of the broader project of queer historiography and for the usefulness of games and play to this kind of intervention in how history is narrated and recorded. Queer historiographic methodology replaces history with genealogy as Foucault defines it, which is opposed to the search for origins, singular answers, and unbroken continuities. Rather, genealogy seeks out exceptions, accidents, the things that have been left out, and asks what such things tell us about the categories and histories that we might take for granted, like queer and trans as categories. I also find Hartman's concept of critical fabulation really useful for understanding this kind of project, the goal of which is, quote, to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened or might have been said or might have been done, end quote. She uses critical fabulation to untangle how we write about past violences without replicating their harm in the present. It can be tempting to approach queer history in a redemptive or reparative mode because our motivation for delving into such histories in the first place may come from a desire to be accepted or assimilate or feel like there's a precedent for who we are. Kaji Amin cautions against this, or at least advocates for a de-idealized vision of queerness that embraces irreparability and the implications of, quote, living with damage in a damaged world. In a similar vein, Heather Love argues for the importance of acknowledging shame, isolation, and self-hatred alongside more politically or ideologically useful feelings like pride, joy, or euphoria when we think about history. Both Amin and Love are interested in understanding what motivates our engagement with history and what we might leave out if we attempt to make the past politically useful. This is precisely what Private Cathedrals lets us explore intimately through constructing a historical record for ourselves, shaped by game mechanics. These theorists are interested in the figures who are left behind because they don't fit neatly into narratives oriented exclusively toward progress, and I think this game is adept at putting us in the shoes of those figures and understanding their positionality. This game is not oriented towards the future, nor does it ask us to make our engagement with the history we're writing useful or instructive. Private Cathedrals is about building a story and a relationship with your characters and feeling what it's like to live in their world. It is deeply relational, and its primary goal is to teach us how to look for what has been forgotten, which is also the primary goal of queer historiography. I am particularly drawn to this game as a tool because it makes space for bad feelings and it doesn't prescribe a particular ending. Love argues that, quote, we need to develop a vision of political agency that incorporates the damage that we hope to repair. And Private Cathedrals is an excellent example of what that looks like in practice. There is no pressure to take on the task of fixing centuries of damage, and there is room for exploring your character's love story in all its messiness, its drama, the ways it's been shaped by the harm your characters have experienced, in addition to the wonderful things that they've discovered. I'm interested in the role of play in how we write and think about history, and the potential of games like Together We Write Private Cathedrals to decenter dominant ways of narrating the past in favor of something more personal and more focused on our affective connections to figures in history. Thus, I argue not only for thinking about this game as a tool of queer historiography, but for making space within queer, trans, and feminist praxis for games and play to disrupt structures of power and redistribute the power of narration. In a moment where many governments and state powers are bent on the eradication of queer and trans life altogether, this game and the relationships it fosters are incredibly important because they give us as players the power to reclaim our narrative and build relationships with those who came before us on our own terms. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Percival. That was such a wonderful paper. Really appreciate the presentation. We're now going to move on to Himadri Agarwal, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name, Himadri. And your paper is You Got Played, Subverting Authority Through Games. So just as Percival theorized the sort of dominant of cis-hetero patriarchal relations, we're going to move into the dominant of authority and consider how to subvert that in this next paper. So take it away, Himadri.
Thank you. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Awesome. This is called You Got Played, Subverting Authority Through Play. My name is Himadri Agarwal, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I'm really happy to be here. So it is well known and often discussed that play is not neutral. The games we play perpetuate biases, reinforce hierarchies, and can be violent in insidious ways. But what is the flip side of that? In this talk, I will analyze two game text combinations, chess in the Hindi short story Shatranj Ke Khiladi, and wargaming in Robert Bolaño's The Third Reich, to show how playing these games is not always an act of complicity, but in fact can be a form of resistance. The first text is a short story, Shatranj Ke Khiladi by Munshi Premchand. This on the left is a poster to a film that was made out of the story. In 1924, written in 1924, it is set in 1856 during the British annexation of Awadh, then Oudh. The story follows a pair of friends, Mir Roshan Ali and Mirza Sajad Ali, who live in Awadh, in the heart of the conflict, and spend most of their time playing game after game of chess. What is it about chess that makes it so attractive, particularly to these two characters who choose to play through the annexation of their city? And in fact, is it the ongoing annexation of their city that takes them deeper into the game? One way to answer that question is simple. Awadh is a city that has surrendered. Even though its king continues to fight for its sovereignty, the populace of the city has plunged itself into opulence, choosing to go out in a wave of drug-induced ecstasy and alcohol highs. And chess gives the characters an alternate space to exist in when the real world has nothing to offer, a so-called distraction from their helplessness in the city burning around them. But are they really helpless? To answer that, let's zoom into the game itself. This story is in Hindustani, and the names for the chess pieces are different. The king is Raja Badshah, meaning king, Rani Wazir, meaning queen. The rook is the hathi, or the elephant. Knight is the ghoda, or horse. Bishop is oont, camel, and pawn is pyada, or foot soldier. What the Hindustani makes even clearer than the Anglophone renditions is that these sets of pieces are effectively armies, and chess is a game of war, being played between the opposing sides of black and white. This has real-world relevance, from Napoleon taking inspirations from chess to chess being used to analyze US action in Iraq, to even a Hindustani poem by Javed Akhtar, which outlines chess as war. In this scenario, with a war raging in the background, dismissing chess as an unproductive pastime seems redundant. It's important to remember also that the protagonists of the story are connected to the war themselves. Mir, in fact, had been called to serve at the war front, but he lies, he chooses not to fight, and instead he sits in a dilapidated mosque with his friend playing chess. The army was not the only choice of action, there's also chess. Chess here becomes the war, even if it is a simulation that Mirza and Mir do have control over, far more than the one against the British. Mir could have chosen to go to the frontiers, but that conflict was a lost cause. This game, on the other hand, can still be won. While they're powerless in the face of the British, they have agency over the chessboard. With the board, they can control their pieces. They reply to their British invaders by taking them out of the war entirely and choosing instead to win it for themselves. In other words, what the battlefield cannot conceive, the chessboard achieves. Just like in Javed Akhtar's poem here, the game becomes the war for them. When there is no hope of a victory on the ground, they attain it in the space of the game, and resisting their oppressors with every move and telling them every time they place a chess piece on the board, you are not a victor. In fact, you're not even a player. This possibility of resistance comes through even more in the form of the story, particularly in the kind of conversations that Mir and Mirza have. One especially meaningful dialogue is here. Mir says, the English forces are approaching, God save us. Mirza, let them come, check, here, save your king. Mir, we must see to this. Mirza, we will see them, check. While Mir is thinking about the approaching British army, Mirza keeps diverting their conversation back to the game. Mir says, God save us, helplessness. Mirza, on the other hand, keeps giving checks and ultimately wins the game. While Mir is still dwelling on the political losses they're enduring, Mirza has realized that chess is the space where they have a say in their futures. This is particularly clear when let them come and save your king come in the same sentence. The comments about the real world come as a part of the same phrases as those about chess. So it's hard to distinguish whether characters are talking about the game or about the real war. These comments about the game follow those about the English approaching, so the game becomes a way of working through the helplessness caused by the invasion. While the actual warlike content of the game is one way to think about this, there's also the game of words the two players seem to be playing. As I read this text, I can almost visualize these two talking quickly, their words slipping over each other, sharp and fast dialogue punctuated by chess moves. Just like the rapid movements of their pieces, these players' words are also playing a game. While one talks about war, the other talks about chess. And in the process of playing one game, he also wins the other. While one is still trying to navigate the British invasion, the other has already set it aside for something that he can control. Here are two people right in the middle of a political upheaval, choosing to play chess, using the same tools of war that are being used against them and saying, forget about the king of Awadh, defend the king on your chessboard. They are literally playing out the war for themselves, claiming their arena and attaining their victory. They say the ongoing war is not important, overturning the hierarchical structure that puts direct political action on a pedestal to instead focus on a chessboard. Their resistance is characterized by interruption. They interrupt a situation that was dominated by oppressors and then claim their own space in that situation. Brazilian activist Augusto Boal, in his Theater of the Oppressed, formulates this idea of resistance using something called forum theater. So here, first a play is performed depicting social or political issues. Then the play starts again, but this time the spectators become spect-actors, which come up on stage, intervene in the plot, and attempt their own solutions of the issue at hand. Boal's spectators interrupted the status quo through theater, and Mir and Mirza go from being spectators of a defeated war to actors in a different war when they adopt the chessboard as a means of resistance. So when the war is presented to them as a problem, they shift the stage to the game and go immediately from being witnesses or spectators to actors and players. Such game-space subversion happens also in the book The Third Reich by Robert Bolaño. The book is named after a fictional war game that the protagonist spends the course of the story playing. It's based on the rise and decline of the Third Reich, which is the board game I've shown here. So in Bolaño's book, a German war game champion, Udo Berger, goes on a holiday to Spain and starts playing the game with a gentleman he meets there. This man, El Comado, is a paddle boat vendor who lives underneath his pile of boats in front of the hotel in which Berger is staying. While in Shatranj Ki Khiladi, the protagonists occupied similar situations, Berger and Comado come from radically different spheres. Udo Berger is a German war game champion. He writes articles about games. The particular game is his profession. He's going to a hotel, practicing his game there in luxury. The Third Reich is a game about war, specifically about the Second World War. The objective for the players is simply to win the war. While the real war has been fought and won and lost, this one is still full of potential. The players have the resources that each of their sides historically possessed, and now it is up to them to make use of them. Udo Berger, our protagonist, is playing on the side of the Axis powers, and he's running headlong into the game with confidence and the advantage of experience. El Comado is different. All through the book, we never find out his real name. He's just El Comado, the burn victim. He has visible facial injuries, and while the cause of his burns is never made fully clear, the suggestion is that he participated in a war of some kind, possibly as Brazilian troops in the Second World War. He lives on the beach opposite the hotel in which Berger and his girlfriend live. So the division between Berger and him is embodied in the high wall of the hotel. So Berger is looking down at him literally from a few floors above him. The novel doesn't take very long to make the hierarchies clear. Berger is at the top of the game. Comado is relegated to the bottom of the social circle. In fact, he's disparaged and shunned to this extent that he's not even allowed to enter the hotel without someone coming to pick him up, which indicates the structural barriers that are imposed on him. Before they start playing this game, the hierarchies are clear-cut and well-defined. It is after the game comes into the picture that they start getting turned in their heads. So towards the beginning, El Comado is still escorted by Berger, is still learning to play, continues to be a newcomer. However, as time passes, he enters the hotel unaccompanied, he engages the hotel owner in discussing the game, and makes it his project to defeat Berger, which actually does happen in the end. Quote, El Comado arrives earlier than usual today, and he comes up alone without waiting for me to meet him. When I open the door, he looks like a figure rubbed out with an eraser, like a suitor who, instead of flowers, carries photocopies clutched to his chest. Soon, I realize what's behind this transformation. The initiative is now his. Even though the setting here is a space like the hotel room, close quote, even though the setting here is a space like the hotel room, and no changes take place in terms of his position in social hierarchies, this victory is a large victory for him. The Third Reich is not a game El Comado has played before. It is a game that is introduced by someone who is framed as his oppressor, and he plays it confidently. He becomes an active creator. When he gets ahead in the game, he also becomes more confident and reclaims the spaces he earlier shied away from. He brings photocopies of action plans, historical milestones, and such, and hands them to Udo Berger, who eventually puts them up on his room wall. Not only is he playing, but he's also changing the literal landscape he is playing in, that too in the hotel room of a world champion. In this situation, El Comado's victory is not simply a paddleboard vendor's victory. It is the victory of a non-Nazi against a Nazi, of the oppressed against the oppressor. While Berger was imposing power with his ranks, titles, and knowledge of the game, El Comado asserted his victory, and this victory subverts the hierarchies. So Shatranj Ki Khiladi takes place in the middle of a political conflict, but the Third Reich is set a few years away from it, in the hotel room where one of the players is on vacation. So it's a setting that's characterized by leisure and non-serious activities. It's easy in that situation to simply say that the Third Reich was a game for the two players. But after we look at the power dynamics in play, it is clear that El Comado is much more than just another opponent playing just another game. This becomes even clearer towards the end of the novel, by when it is apparent who the winner is going to be. At this point, the owner of the hotel, Frau Welsey's husband, who had in fact helped El Comado get his victory, asks Berger what is going to happen at the end of the game. And the conversation goes like this. Frau Welsey's husband says, it's all in the history books, so on and so forth. Let the trial of the war criminals begin. And Berger points out decisive victory, tactical victory, marginal victory, stalemate. We don't have trials or stupid things like that. And then he replies, my friend, in that poor boy's nightmares, the trial may be the most important part of the game. The only thing that makes it worthwhile to spend so many hours playing, a chance to hang the Nazis. This conversation is the climax of the story, the crescendo of the story. This is El Comado's time. It is his chance to not just win the game, but to achieve the victory that was the reason behind him playing in the first place. A chance to hang the Nazis may be metaphorical, maybe coming years after the war, but this is at the core of the narrative. El Comado is playing a war game not as a game, but as an opportunity to win against the Nazis, this time on his own terms, and to hang them, to overturn their authority, to subvert their power through a medium like a game, as if to tell them that they would never win, not then, not now, and not ever. El Comado, like Mir and Mirza, becomes a spectator rather than a spectator when he chooses to participate in Berger's war game, becoming a part of the war, like he had possibly been earlier as well, but this time on his own terms. Such resistance is not unique to these two games. and there are instances across both ludic and literary canons of such. But it is the unique format of board games which makes resistance democratic. Much like Augusto Boal's theater, games enable common people to take active part in change. And in a world where every space builds such high walls around it, there is something radical about a conversation that lets so many of us speak. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Himadri. That was an excellent, excellent presentation. I feel like this panel so far is just batting 1,000. Next up, we have Mirek Stolee with Envisioning an Archive for Legacy Board Games, which I think we're moving a little into materialities of games with this paper, thinking through legacy games as these games that are sort of like unseating the hegemonic past of board games with these materials and components that we want to hang on to and treasure for the rest of our lives. So anyways, Mirek, really excited for your paper. Have at it.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's share my screen. Okay. All right, there you go. So yes, hi, I am Mirek Stolee. I'm sorry, I'm Mirek Stolee. My presentation is called Envisioning an Archive for Legacy Board Games, as Aaron said. I'm a text and technology PhD student at the University of Central Florida. First of all, this is going to have pretty severe spoilers for Pandemic Legacy Season 1 and Risk Legacy, which are games that have storylines. So if that is, yeah, just watch out. I'm sorry. So to talk about legacy games, just if you're not familiar, so typically, this is one lens of looking at it. I think of games as having a game state, right? We go through a series of at any sort of temporal moment or at a specific state in the game. And in typical like board games, that state is stored informationally in the components, in like their locations, how they're positioned. But you know, that game state is lost, you know, as soon as the pieces are knocked over or moved or whatever. But legacy games make it a point that of this sort of permanence. Like, note, you know, this is, in order to open Risk Legacy, you have to rip open this sticker that assumes that you are complying and acknowledging that what's done can never be undone. These are permanent changes to the game state. We see, like, you know, semi-permanent. We have stickers that go on the board, and this is a Fallout Zone sticker when a nuclear explosion happens at some point in the story, and that zone is now like irregular. It is, you know, permanently altered in mechanics as well. So this, you know, through the campaign of a legacy game, you go through, and the idea is that you are making permanent changes and ultimately creating a unique version of your game. So this is Pandemic Legacy, and a scan of my board when I was finished with the game. And my idea is, you know, if we have access to these sort of artifacts, you know, there is information embedded in these artifacts. And what sort of like comparative research can we gain from archiving these? What is the benefits of preserving, you know, these sort of gameplay artifacts? So you know, just a couple like theoretical lenses or things that are similar that I think are interesting. We can think about game saves, you know, how we save our video game data. Those are sort of gameplay traces that are stored in you know, bits. And we can even see these as like, you know, individual files you can share on sites like this. You know, you can have DJ Sonic's copy of Banjo-Kazooie, right? And these sort of things, like game saves, are used in sort of interesting comparative ways already by game designers. So this is Ben Medler talking about player dossiers, which are like collections of statistics of a single player's play. And games like The Walking Dead and New Frontier use this sort of information as a sort of debriefing tool. You'd be like, oh, you know, only me and 40.5% of players went after Gabe, right? So, and we can think about saving in other physical ways as well. Samuel Tobin does this already. I'm talking about in digital games, even when we are, you know, rubbing on our controllers, we are creating like, you know, saves memory on the sort of the way the controller wears, the way that, you know, my body might change. And then, of course, comparing to one of our amazing keynote speech talks today, So we can talk about crafting and keepsake games, games that are really focused on the physical artifact. So Anne Sullivan and Gillian Smith talk about craft games, which are games in which they incorporate typical craft activities. So their game Thread Setting involves using a sewing machine and creating this sort of quilt-like object. And Shin Ying Kor's games uses this term keepsake games, which are games that produce beautiful, memorable artifacts through the process of playing the game. And importantly, these are a collaboration between designer and player. They make unique items, and there is this environmental aspect as well. They create these sort of sentimental objects, provide a sort of end of life of these sort of games. And important to Ian Kor's understanding is that the keepsake is a sort of byproduct of the gameplay process. This sort of the permanence is the gameplay, right? These are very closely intertwined. So we can see this in games like A Field Guide to Memory by Jeon Shim and Shin Ying Kor, where you create this sort of journal with all sorts of artifacts within it, the sort of mixed media art. In Jeon Shim's game The Snow Queen, where you're creating a keepsake, another sort of handmade journal. So legacy games, pull in, at least in their marketing, pull on this sort of like, we are going to create this unique game. This is a major draw of the game, is that you are making these permanent changes and creating this sort of artifact. So I think there's a lot of resonance there between these concepts. So to specifically talk about an archive for legacy games and what that might accomplish, and a lot of like ongoing questions I have during this process, because it's very much in its infancy. I can look at other like archives for board games specifically. So Analog Joy Club is an archive run by Nathan Altice, which specifically archives Japanese board games. And we can see, the way that he is, organizing this archive is through digital files that you can actually access just on Google Drive. So I'm thinking, what sort of software should I be using, and how that decision might be driven by the methods of preservation or what kinds of access I want to provide to this archive. So I can think of, in terms of the sort of bias thing, I find myself going back and forth on this sort of needle, because I feel like, I can emphasize the analog, I can emphasize the digital, but I think to do both takes on, I have very limited resources, right? But in the sort of like analog thing, like we can see that, there is an environmental impact to board games that's increasingly being recognized. And Paul Booth, specifically talks about how legacy games as this sort of disposable product. You play a campaign, then you're done, right? And then they go away. You can throw them away. But and these are not super recyclable. The box might itself be recyclable, but the cards are actually plastic coated, despite what you might think. So those are not recyclable. So the typical like end of life of a game like Pandemic Legacy is to go to the landfill, which this is one of the most popular board games on Board Game Geek. So it's that is not ideal. So I can think we see like behavior from some players that are moving towards this sort of keepsake direction. So Booth acknowledges this when in his own experience that he wanted to make a sort of like display of his games after playing, and we can see this in Board Game Geek users like John Huss creating these sort of shadow boxes that display as a sort of work of art their gameplay artifact. Michael Rosario also does this with their copy. So, and this is something that I think as a sort of other end of life thing that companies try to push, but I don't think really happens, is the idea that you're making a unique copy of your game, and then when it's done, you can keep it and you can play your probably quite unbalanced, unique version. But this is something that Clank Legacy pushes. You have this version of the game that is actually playable, rather than just as a piece of art on the wall. And then an archive as a sort of alternative to that, or a supplement, which I'll talk about in a bit. So that talking about those sort of things, that's about preserving the physical object. But we can see in digital archives, access is enhanced significantly through like digitizing things. So this is something that maybe brings me more towards the digitalization aspect. So to draw on like my previous work at Generation Analog, I was talking about like adapting physical board games into digital board games. And I have these concepts, mediation and digitization. So talking about these sort of shades in between fully analog games and fully digital games. So I have this process called mediation, in which physical objects are become digital objects, representations of those objects. And digitization is where we take the game state stored in the physical components and make it computer readable, make it as data that the computer understands. So we can see this in like meeples on Tabletop Sim, or digitization. Ignore the pseudocode. It's not real code. Ignore it. But digitization as making the computer understand this sort of gameplay information. So in digital adaptation, I talk about this sort of digitization process as a prerequisite for enforcing the rules, creating a version of the game where the computer knows what's going on, so it can enforce the rules for you. But if I talk about this in terms of digitization for archival purposes, we can think of mediation in terms of digital scanning components, and digitization taking information directly and putting it into a database in which that can be operated upon. So in this case, scans of my copy of Pandemic Legacy, or the storage of that information in very boring spreadsheets, but that might have actually interesting insights. So ultimately, for analysis, we accomplish a lot of these goals just through digitization. If I just create a bunch of spreadsheets for everyone's Pandemic Legacy games, we can do a lot of interesting computation on that. So when we take this stuff, we put it into digital data. So I'm going to talk about a couple case studies, Pandemic Legacy Season 1 and Risk Legacy, and talk about how those can, the data can sort of be extracted from those to create such a database. So here is a copy of my copy of Pandemic Legacy. We can see, I kept some sort of record of which games we won, when we played them. We can see it's quite incomplete, but this sort of information can be stored in a sort of spreadsheet and put into a database as various, computational information. So we can see, even we are beholden to the record keeping of the players as well, though. When they have this sort of digital scanning of the game, which has all the cities and their information, and specifically, the sort of what stickers are on each city, what kind of panic level is at each city. This also, can be stored in a sort of database structure. A city has these properties, right? And even just like the characters, which you can name your characters, they develop relationships with other characters, they get special abilities, they get scars, which are, permanent disadvantages for that character. And these things, we can be stored these as, computer data as well. There is like a limited list of what these things can be, especially for scars and upgrades, right? So character information can similarly be stored in this sort of just like very boring spreadsheet, very clinical. And even the final results of the game are easily transferable, though we can see another problem with the conversion to digital here is I can't read my handwriting at all. So, and this applies to Risk Legacy as well, the same sort of ideas. So really, I'm looking at how necessary is having this sort of physical object in an archive, or scanning it even, right? Do we need to scan these objects? Because when we're in this sort of digital aspect, I can just send out a survey on Google Forms and have everyone just enter the information from their copy. I don't need to actually see it, right? There is that makes it easier to add things to the archive, and it makes it we get a lot of data to be accessible, right? So even like a shadow box, they don't have to dismantle their shadow box too much, hopefully, to provide at least some of this information. And because there's such a limited number of states here, there's especially these games don't have a ton of room for like crazy weird stuff that would not fit cleanly in this database. But we get the sort of problem, right? These physical components then become disposable as well. We just extract this data from them, right? And what happens with that? We can see this in other like records, like digitizing books. When we put a book online, we are creating a model of that book that has specific affordances. And the same is the case for board games like legacy games. And the way that we structure that database leaves room for specific, that enables these certain affordances. What information can be captured and what cannot, right? So, the fact that, I have all these signatures here, these are not really readable, right? or the fact that my friends put a bunch of stickers upside down. I don't know why, it's terrible, but I have to make some sort of, does that matter? Should that be recorded in the digital form, and how, if so? Or, things that are like, how if we have a data type and someone has a pictorial representation that they've drawn, how do we store that, right? These things become more difficult to understand. Just to wrap up with some final ethical considerations that I think you should consider in any sort of archival project. The fact that I'm thinking about player data, and these are sentimental objects for people. Is it important to how do we handle privacy? What information is collected? How is it accessible? How is it stored? And then finally, ultimately, if I'm taking these games, whether I'm taking the physical copy or not, I am removing them from the context of play, which is a very special moment for these people playing, maybe, or maybe things that are acceptable in a certain group of players may not be when it is put on in a sort of publicly accessible archive. So ultimately, I'm thinking, what's gained and lost if I prioritize physicality and digitality, and then thinking, should I be gathering information on the game's players? Or just the game itself, and what kind of research is enabled and removed as an option by following those options. So that's it from me. Thank you all very much. I'm really excited to be here and chat in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirek. That was an awesome, everything is awesome in this panel so far. We should have just renamed it the Everything is Awesome, Not Stolen from the Lego Movie panel. I learned so much there. I really love the photos of the framed board games and stuff. Just beautiful. All right, next up we have Scott DeJong and Marc Lajeunesse. I believe Marc is going to be presenting, and the paper they're presenting is Homebrewing Homebrew towards a creator-centered definition of game modification and tabletop role-playing. And for those of you who don't know, this is one of the really cool things about analog games, is that analog games can very often be homebrewed and given informal rules by the people who play them. So that's another kind of subversion of authority that's happening within this space. So anyways, Marc and Scott, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Is there sound?
We're gonna need a little more volume, I think.
Hold on. Did that improve anything at all? No.
The closer it is to your mouth, the better, but it's still very low.
Let's
If you want, we could see if the next panelist could swap with you while you kind of play with your tech.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Okay, well, next up then we have Stephen Dashiell. We'll be very happy that I pronounced his last name correctly, because I often don't. With his paper, Situating the Table, Gaming Doxa, Gamer Exceptionalism, and Perceptions of Inequality in Analog Gaming. And every time I've ever seen Stephen present something, I've always been blown away by how interesting it is. And so I'm really looking forward to this presentation. Stephen, take it away.
All right, number one, let me just say I wanted to be last, so I'll just deal with that. Okay, here's my presentation. Let's go with my slideshow. All right, there we are. So my name is Stephen Dashiell. I am what am I? I am a postdoc at American University under the Game Center, and I do a lot of research, not on games, but on gaming culture. So the vast majority of my research is on gaming culture. If you've heard me speak before, you probably heard me say the line that there's a lot of individuals who say that we need more people at the table in terms of gaming and a more diverse number of people at the table. And I always say, maybe the problem is not the number of people at the table, but the problem is the table. And in looking at it from that point of view, I felt like I needed to put my money where my mouth is and actually do a presentation and a theoretical presentation talking about the issues related to the table. So this is a paper that's about to be submitted to a journal. So feel free to make comments, give me any feedback, because I will definitely take it seriously. For those of you who do not know, I am like 150% practice theorist. So I am Bordeaux every day and night. And I am happy that in gaming studies, there is a lot of practice theory modeled after the work of Pierre Bourdieu. We, of course, have Mia Consalvo's Gaming Capital, which talks about game-related knowledge and resources. We have Kirkpatrick's Gamer Habitus, and Tom Appleby also used Gamer Habitus, which is talking about the embodied dispositions. Zhu just put out some papers about 3 years ago looking at Gamer Habitus and made this major point to say every different game has a different Gamer Habitus, which is just awesome. And then there's the Djokovic paper from 2022 that says ludic habitus, and it's talking about these acquired patterns of perception and appreciation in gaming. And we've got a lot of Bourdieu covered. We've got habitus, we've got capital, we've got field, but the thing we don't really have is doxa, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. In the gaming subculture, we have a lot of controversy. We, of course, have Gamergate and Wowgate that occurred in LARPs. We have that dust up at Activision and Blizzard at the end of, 2021, as far as sexual harassment that was going on in the company. And all of these circumstances involving gaming caused an outsized level of alarm. I mean, not only did they make national and international news, but they were the major points of topics on various boards, and at least 3 of these things I've written papers on that are either out or about to be out. So yes, these are big deals. Doxa, as far as Bourdieu, involves society's taken for granted unquestioned truths. These ideas that we simply don't even question, we don't even need to say them in most cases because people simply know they're true. There's social elements that tend to be self-evident, and doxa is heavily dependent on the process of socialization. In other words, you're not born knowing doxa. Through gender socialization and cultural socialization, you start to understand what doxa is. Generally, doxa is not empirically factual, but it's deeply believed. So it may not be something that is scientifically proven. It may not be something that's necessarily true, but it is deeply believed. One of the things I talk about when I teach race, class, and gender is doxa, like discrimination, is caught not taught, meaning somebody's not going to sit you down and teach you doxa, but through the process of socialization and through the process of dealing with individuals, you learn doxa by osmosis. And that is something that people come to understand. And it could be a result of specious reasoning. A lot of doxa is specious reasoning. Here's an example of doxa. If someone else gets a job I apply for, then they are more appropriate for the job. They're better qualified than me. That is what we tend to think. And doxa leads us to believe that whoever got the job is more qualified than us. Logically, we know that's not true. Logically, we know there could be a billion reasons as to why somebody else got the job. Maybe they knew the people sitting across the table. Maybe, like one academic job I applied for, they already had in their mind who they wanted, and they just had to fill out the rest of the interviews. And doxa causes us in this situation to feel really bad about ourselves because it's like, well, I guess I wasn't qualified when that probably wasn't the reason. It could be the reason, but our social structure encourages us to believe that is the reason. In terms of gaming doxa, which is a concept that I come up with in the paper, there are a couple of ideas. Number one is the idea that gaming is a nerdy countercultural space. And when I was explaining this paper to somebody about 2 or 3 days ago and saying, yeah, there's this belief that gaming is a nerdy countercultural space, and somebody was like, yes, it is. And I'm like, wait. And that nerds have historically been targets for scorn and derision. They've been seen as outsiders. They've been marginalized. And due to this outsiderness, it's inherent in gamers. It comes to be expected. Marginalized people then understand what it's like to be kept out and accordingly won't practice discrimination or gatekeeping as much. That goes along with the doxa, which explains a part of the outrage when we actually see heavy gatekeeping and discrimination. marginalized people are also more liberal leaning. That's the belief. And respect politics surrounding identity and inclusion. In queer theory and queer sociology, when C. Winter Hahn talks about this, where people get really shocked about the fact that, like, what do you mean gay people can be racist? Of course gay people can be racist. But there's this idea that simply because individuals are living in a marginalized condition of sexual orientation in our society, that it would absolve them of all other isms, and we know that's not true. And marginalized people would tend to see character and align with the community of gamers first. One of the reasons that I believe that we have this outsized outrage to these circumstances that pop up in gaming is because of this existing gaming doxa. We don't admit it. I'm writing it down, so I'm admitting it. And the fact is that because it is on some subconscious level believed by us, when it's violated, it becomes more serious. And of course, gaming culture is a part of a larger social world. Gaming culture is a subculture, which means that it has most of the qualities of the dominant culture. It has some other things that it prizes, but it has most of the quality. And it does not excise discriminatory behavior. There's still going to be sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, everything in subcultures that could in many ways mirror what is going to be in the dominant culture. I always say, from a sociological point of view, how much racism is there in the games? Well, how much racism is there outside of games? Because it's going to be almost consistent as far as the percentage. There's a more heightened response because of this doxa. How could this happen here? And normally when people say that around me, I'm like, how could it not happen here? There's an attempt to mark these as aberrations, as these are flashes in the pan. This is the one bad apple. Everybody else is not like this. And due to gaming doxa, even perpetrators who see themselves as individuals in the group, when they do mar their situation, they see themselves as enlightened. Twitter is loaded with individuals who in the gaming world have done really horrible things, but then went on Twitter to talk about all the good things that they've done and the fact that they are anti-racist and Black Lives Matter. And it's like, but that doesn't erase what you've done. And it is a recognition that there's an expectation of this liberalism and this enlightenment in the gaming world. And it's apparent in other marginalized spaces. I can just say comic books, and there you go. As far as the fact that we see the same type of behavior in other spaces. It also involves exceptionalism, and Butler, who writes a lot about Black studies, says that exceptionalism revolves around a set of differences measured as social indicators. When Butler was talking about Black exceptionalism, he was talking about a series of statistics that serve as determiners and serve as a mechanism of stereotype threat for African-American men. So pointing out the fact that African-American men have to live in a world where everybody knows 1 out of every 3 African-American men are in prison, or that African-American men are more likely to die from heart disease. And what he points out is that Black male exceptionalism serves as a bulwark in the head of individuals that they always have to think of it, dual consciousness. One example in gaming is that there is, and I've read multiple papers that say more than half of gamers are women, or the idea that I read one paper, one master's thesis that pointed out, well, 40% of people that play Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition are LGBT. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'd love to believe that's true, but I just need to find the data. And the fact was that a lot of these reports that we see, when we see these numbers of interest across gender for games, they're looking at all games. They're looking at casual games, they're looking at CRPGs, they're looking at analog games, they're looking at all games, because having seen some of these surveys, they don't define game very well. And I can tell you, having done in the Game Center a recent study where we were trying to recruit Diablo hardcore players, the simple fact is that trying to find individuals who were female, non-binary, or trans that were Diablo hardcore players was a lot harder than trying to find individuals who identified as men or male. Gamer exceptionalism, then, according to me, is the conjunction, in conjunction with gamer doxa, allows for the creation and formation of a narrative that because gaming spaces are becoming more diverse, misogyny and negative characteristics associated with male-dominated spaces are out of the ordinary. However, it denies the fact that gaming spaces have always been diverse. Women have always been present in the creation of gaming spaces. They've been erased, but they've always been present. The same with LGBT communities, the same with communities of color. Game culture is multi-layered and discipline related, and gaming is culturally associated with male-dominated spaces. People tend to think, if they have to make a stereotype about gamers, they tend to think of men. And then it has characteristics of the male preserve. I would recommend reading my paper from IJRP, talking about the idea of gaming as a male preserve, TRPGs as a male preserve. It's also important to note that gaming has multiple layers, and this adds to the problem. There are microcultures, the table you sit at, subcultures, which is associated with games, and the larger culture. And the problem is that sometimes people engage only in their microculture. Their table is diverse. Their table is mostly women. Their table is a panoply of individuals, that they lose sight of the fact that the subculture may not necessarily be that diverse. Microcultures are and have always been diverse, but they can be controlling images. For me, my microculture coming into TRPG, my first games involved 11 or 12 people. The first time I sat to play D&D with 4 people, it was weird as hell for me, because it's like, no, D&D as I've always played it has 10 people at the table. And that just goes to show the effect of the microculture. People commonly base normative assumptions off of microcultures, and confusion due to conflation of microcultures and subcultures and gaming cultures can lead to people to not recognize the power of gaming doxa. This also involves the idea of network privilege, as Aaron wrote about himself in his book that was published this year. And this is based off authority and capital that is commonly displayed by white heterosexual men. And this very much dovetails on some of my work to say that in order to succeed in these subcultural spaces, you actually have to act in some ways like white heterosexual men in order to activate that network privilege. And that can be done in various ways, but since they're the ones that create the norms, then you kind of have to follow those. Gaming habitus involves playing the game in a way that is adhering to the expectations of the field. And if one is not the normal embodiment of the network privilege, then they have to try harder to emulate, because there's the possibility of double consciousness, of thinking that individuals are going to see you differently because you are of a minoritized status. There is resistance to change and conservative shifts. People have heard, you're ruining my childhood, trolls and resistors. However, this is just a reinforcement of network privilege, asserting a structure of power. And individuals link assumptions with a turbulent history of perceived growth and diversity. Very quickly, I just want to say that Stan Lee said that people in comics don't want change, they want the illusion of change. And what we find is a significant portion of individuals that don't want real change, they want things that look like change and that can easily be changed back, which becomes a significant part of understanding how gaming doxa plays into this whole thing. And this is just summing up everything that I said. And if anybody has any questions, comments, or any type of advice on this, I would be open to it, because like I said, the draft of this paper is written, but I would love any feedback people offer. I want to thank all of these people because their work has helped me to frame this theoretical work. And if you want to get my information, you can scan the UI and kaboom, there it is. All right, I'm done.
Awesome. Always a treat to encounter Stephen's work, and like really interesting way to have almost wrapped up the panel, because Stephen is pushing us to think about questions of how we theorize and understand our culture itself, and to not take for granted what we think as left or subversive or something like that, to try to recognize that maybe the forces of domination are more complex that we're up against. All right, we have back up again on Homebrew Games, Scott DeJong and Marc Lajeunesse.
Hello.
Your microphone is absolutely working now. So I'm gonna get
Incredible.
lost and give you both the floor.
Amazing. Thanks a lot. Let me maximize this here. Yes, hello. So I am Marc Lajeunesse, presenting on behalf of Marc Lajeunesse and Scott DeJong on Homebrewing Homebrew towards a creator-centered definition of game modification in tabletop role-playing. So what is this project, and what are the questions we're asking here? This is a bigger project on the concept of homebrew. And our primary question here that we're asking is, how do tabletop role-playing games, things like Pathfinder, Dungeons and Dragons, curate space for player modification? Right. And before we get into that, though, let's actually talk a bit about what is homebrew, because every time we bring this up, someone always comments on you're talking about beer, right? And no, we're not, but the process is actually not too dissimilar, right? Here's the most relevant pop culture image I could think of when thinking about homebrew, which is Hank Schrader from Breaking Bad and his homebrewed beer Schrader Brow. And you know, what is homebrewing a beer? It's about taking a mass-produced product, but putting your own spin on it, doing it in the comfort of your own working environment, and you know, trying to make something that is industry focused, DIY. And that's the same thing that homebrew is about, right? It's a player driven creative practice that alters and adapts the rules, themes, and aesthetics of a published game to a particular table or audience. Now, what is being adapted here? If you're thinking about a tabletop role-playing game, there's so much that goes into it, right? There's the setting, the world that the game takes place in. There's all the mechanical elements, like the mathy numbers, and homebrew can account for all of those things, right? So that's what players are changing. This is part of a much larger project on Homebrew that looks at the history, distribution, design, and play experience of these kinds of player modifications for tabletop role-playing games, primarily through the Pathfinder role-playing game system. But today we're going to focus on a small segment of that, which is just like, what is a good definition of Homebrew for tabletop role-playing, and how did we get there? And also, why Pathfinder? Well, the reason we've settled on Pathfinder is because it itself, releasing in 2009, the first edition of Pathfinder by Paizo, is itself this kind of homebrewed mass market product that is an offshoot of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, where Paizo was releasing their own supplements to this Dungeons & Dragons product. But when D&D was switching from 3.5 to 4, the folks at Paizo decided that what Dungeons and Dragons were doing was they were going to a kind of more limited licensing system. So it was going to be more difficult to make customizable material for Dungeons and Dragons in 4th edition. And the Paizo folks were like, well, we don't like that. So let's maybe make our own game system that is a bit more open. And if you've been following stuff with Wizards of the Coast and the open gaming license that has just occurred, we've actually kind of just seen a repeat of this again. So anyway, we're focusing on Pathfinder, both editions, but mostly 2nd edition as our focus of this study. What are we looking at today is we're looking at interviews with 7 different homebrewers, tabletop creators for Pathfinder products. 2 of whom are GMs and third-party makers. We're looking at a games co-op, and then 1 solo freelancer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about who these folks are, because I think it's really interesting to think about how each of them got into designing and playing these games differently, and how they approach how they're able to modify these games. And we'll build on a definition from there. So who are these folks that we talked to? Well, one of them is a pair of brothers from Toronto called Mammoth Island Games, who were originally DMs for both Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder. And they were, according to themselves, and I believe them, they were pretty well-received DMs within their local communities. The game stores wanted them to come back and run games. So they got really familiar by running these official Pathfinder adventures over time. And as they became more familiar with the system, they found that there were there's a lot of clunkiness to the rules, especially in Pathfinder 1st edition. There were a lot of things that were needlessly complicated. And so they started to develop their own rules changes that would make aspects of the system a bit simpler. And they first started by putting these online for, you know, public consumption. And they thought that, well, maybe we should try and not only monetize their product, but to make it a more official thing. And so they went with itch.io, which is used for independent video game design a lot. And they released an official set of rules where people could pay what they want, and also an official booklet that is still for sale on their itch.io page. So if you would like to support them, you could do that. To codify these rules into practice, because rather than them just being, things that circulate on forums informally, putting them in a book or for consumption kind of codifies them within this player base, even though they aren't necessarily officially released supplements. Our second group is called Eldritch Osiris Games, which is a cooperative of, I think now they have 8 members, of which we've spoken to 4 so far. And their whole conceit was that it is actually really difficult to get the kind of published work that is of a quality that players want to consume out into the wild without working as a team. And so a few core members of this started to accrue a team of people that also allowed them to have far more diverse perspective on the kind of content that players might want, and allows them to reach a wider audience with a bit more of a thoughtful or collaborative approach to the way that they are designing these supplements for their games. And our final brewer is Michelle Jones, who is a solo freelancer who got into Pathfinder because compared to D&D, all the Pathfinder rules are available online for free. And so she started playing Pathfinder, she started developing her own supplements, and at the same time, she was also very vocally critical of Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons and Dragons, particularly on how they depict race, gender, sexuality in game, that she was contacted by a member of Paizo who invited them to be not an employee, but to contract through Paizo, which is awesome. And now she's at the time of the notes that I have, she's on 13 official Paizo products, but working as an independent contractor, right? So not as an employee. So she's still doing this kind of brewy third-party thing from outside, right? And before we get into the definition, across all of our interviews so far, one thing that I really want to highlight is that there is a high demand for published homebrewed products, right? Players really are clamoring for alternatives to what the mainstream design is for these games, but players don't want to pay. And in fact, if you self-promote on sites like Reddit, where there is visibility, people become pretty aggressive to these creators, because the idea is that, all your labor should be free, but we desperately want to consume this, right? Like it's worth saying that these creators have in the thousands to possibly tens of thousands of downloads across all of their materials. So there is a demand for these, but again, they find it really difficult to convert this into any kind of long-standing self-sustaining enterprise. Michelle may be a bit differently because she's actually paid by Paizo on contract, but her own work I think is fairly difficult to sell. So let's bring it back to the definition of homebrew here. And we aren't creating our definition out of anywhere. We're brewing our own definition off of a prior definition of homebrew that Melanie Swalwell applied to microcomputing and these tinkerers of old microcomputer systems who would develop their own homebrewed games on these old computing systems, right? And her definition has 5 parts here: that homebrew productions were made domestically in the home, that homebrew games were largely homebrew game makers were largely self-taught programmers. They learned it all on their own. They were made by an individual, lone actors who were doing this self-motivatedly. Homebrew games were often not published. They were distributed informally, and that these homebrewed products were marked with an experimental ethic, a kind of boundary pushing, whether that is in terms of content or in terms of like how you're pushing the technology forward to make these games. That was fundamental in homebrew. And we're going to kind of look at these 5 points a little bit more in detail as it relates to the tabletop environment, as we've seen through our interviews here. So on domesticity, are they still domestic? And not really. Like, players can homebrew at their own table in their own homes, but as Mike here points out, homebrew is kind of turned into something that is more akin to third-party publishing, where people are really intent on taking their home campaigns and formalizing them in ways, and that was made possible by the OGL, the Open Gaming License, specifically for Pathfinder, right? So the idea is, even if you are brewing at home, and this is where a lot of our homebrewers started, is just changing their own games, there is, and this isn't necessarily the tabletop market itself, this is just the way we work in the world now, where, you know, you are encouraged to turn everything you do into some kind of monetization for yourself, right? It's the constant hustle, it's the constant gig economy, and this falls into that, right? So you're always kind of pushed to be thinking beyond the homebrew and into, I don't know, what I coined yesterday is like the world brew. There is always a potential second market for your brew. Self-taught. None of these folks are totally self-taught, right? There's kind of a pedagogical question here about, like, well, what is learning by oneself? Are you ever truly learning alone? And as we can see here, even with Michelle, these folks are always interacting with the people that they're playing with at their table. In the case of the two brothers, they're collaborating together. The co-op itself is learning together, and there's always stuff bouncing off of the community, right? So there's more of a communal sense of learning, where all these brewers are figuring out how this works in these informal networks of various sizes. And that goes into this, which is like, individuals are these independent creators, and not really, because people are independently creating in these small informal groups or these more formalized groups like Eldritch Osiris Games, right? There is a collaborative framework that underpins all of this. And I think you can see that too in the way these games are designed. You're meant to play a TTRPG with a bunch of people. Your party is meant to be collaborating together. And that kind of, I don't know, that gameplay element also translates to how work around homebrew is being done. Not publish, like according to Swalwell's definition, things weren't published, but now that's not really true, right? So we would modify Swalwell's criteria a little bit to say that there is an increased drive to publish this creative material. And when it is published, compared to the microcomputing stuff, it is much, much easier to reach a large audience. In fact, Mammoth Island Games was really surprised by how many people they were able to reach, how many downloads they were able to get once they did publish their stuff, because there is a lot of interest. But again, no one really wanted to pay for it. And then finally, experimental. Is there still a homebrew, like an experimental ethic to homebrew? Kind of. I'm going to go over this quote by Michelle here, which is that adventures have to be written for general audiences, so they have to be kind of one size fits all. So even in our professional work, it's always like, can we have this, you know, queer romance? Can we have this gay couple who has kids, and let's have them be NPCs in the town? But again, it has to be general. You're creating this kind of, I don't know, thinking about gamer doxa or like hegemony, the acceptable playable version of a gay couple in as NPCs in this game that appeals to a mass market audience. And so thinking about like the more, I don't know, interpersonal, personal experience of that narrative, it's something that homebrew lets you carry out, whether that's at the table or whether that's publishing or advertising your game through a different source than the official material. And so we have modified our definition of TTRPG homebrew somewhat to say this: homebrew exists between domestic and institutional spaces. There's a tension there between your own game and the potential games that exist out in the world. It's collaborative, both between players and DMs, but also between your potential audiences and your potential partners in creating homebrew material and getting it out in the world. It's mostly private, but there are more opportunities and drives to publish. Like, you are kind of pushed to do this, not by homebrew itself, but by our modern economic situation. And then homebrew is experimental, opening up new worlds and interactions through design, that this can clash with expectations from audiences of various sizes. What does our table do versus what does the market do, right? And before I close, I'm gonna give Scott a chance if there was anything that he wanted to say about homebrew.
I think it's just important to like posit that this is part of like the larger project that we're engaging in. Marc covers like the really key kind of theory piece, and I've been chatting with some of you in the Discord channel kind of about some of the themes as it relates to your own work. And honestly kind of want to follow up with a bunch of you. So I'm going to leave it there because I think I put some context in the Discord. And I think there's room for questions now for all the panelists, and I don't want to take away that time.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's it. Thanks for listening. You can contact us here. And I also wanted to say that this whole event is awesome. Thanks, Aaron, and everyone involved, the co-presenters. Like, this is so rad. So thanks, everybody.
Well, we're really glad to have you. And just to reiterate, it takes a village. So all of us here at AGS have been working around the clock, and probably me least of all. So also Evan, Ed, Shelley, and Megan have been really pounding the pavement to make this work. So but we talk also outside of this, so I'm really glad you're here too, Marc and Scott. And this was such a great panel. I was so excited by everything that went on in this panel. So if everybody wants to turn their cameras on, and maybe if you're in the audience, if you could offer some Q&A. Now, we had 5 papers, which again, this was the mega panel, so things probably moved on a little faster than most of you could kind of remember. Definitely, if you have overarching questions that anyone could respond to, I think those would be really healthy for conversation. But if you have targeted questions also, that'd be good. And we also, I know Evan Turner had written an early question for Percival. So while everybody else is thinking about the questions that they're going to ask in the Q&A box, I'm going to read out Evan's question. And this appeared in the Discord, and maybe it got responded to. But what impact do specific letter materialities have on play? Playing with quill and ink versus typewriter versus pen and pencil would be very different. And so, Percival, if you have any thoughts on that, and if anyone else wants to take a stab at that after Percival, we'd be very open to that. And again, if you're in the audience, please write some questions into chat.
Yeah, I think the biggest role that materialities might play in private cathedrals in this kind of game is more about how we situate ourselves as players in the world, how we make ourselves sort of feel like we are taking on the role of our characters or in the time period that we've selected. Like what is the way that we can sort of set ourselves up to have the most ideal sort of embodied experience of writing, because I think what this game is really good at is putting us in that mindset and giving us a sense of like, oh, okay, I am taking ownership of this, and I'm creating the circumstances under which I feel like I'm doing that, is I think the way materiality figures into it for me.
It's a great answer. Any other thoughts on that question? I know you all touched on materialities of some kind, but maybe not that explicitly. Well, we can move on from that because that was a very specific question. I'm still waiting for some questions to come in on the Q&A, so I'm gonna have to kind of think through if there are some questions that I have. But I guess, you know, I kind of teased this while we were talking it out, but one thing that I was fascinated by was how you all were kind of in conversation with one another on some level, thinking about these forces of domination and how they impact tabletop games and tabletop game worlds. So I guess my question for you all is just like thinking critically about this conversation that we've had on a broader scale. Is there anything you'd point to in another presentation that was just like, yes, that's a thing that we really should be tending to?
I think what Stephen was saying about microcultures versus subcultures and stuff like that, I think particularly for legacy games, it's something that you are meant to play with the same group multiple times over like this sort of thing. So like that, I feel like that's a very specific microculture. And that makes me feel like, you know, what are, in terms of like diversity, you know, what are these microcultures, like who's in there, who's excluded, you know, what kind of, what's happening there. So I thought that was like, yeah, super cool.
Yeah, the question of who gets to play and who plays when is something that's been running across all of these conversations that we've been having. And so in the Discord, there's been a lot of talk about community and community building and the way communities get formed in, say, like a story like Shatranj Ke Khiladi, or in the games that we've been talking about, or in Pandemic Legacy. They all they're very different from each other, but they all boil down to who are you playing with and how does that change who you are?
I also was really excited by what Mirek was talking about in terms of like not only who is playing and what are we doing when we play, but like how do we remember the stuff that we did, and sort of questioning that disposability or the idea that we have to move on really quickly to the next thing. Like I think thinking about archives is like obviously very interesting to me, but also really useful in such an ephemeral form.
And that actually relates to something I didn't talk about, but a very Bourdieu concept of gaming capital. And having those narratives and those stories about playing experiences, that is capital. I mean, being able to talk about that you've gone through certain types of games, or you and a group of friends did this and you did it in record time, that is a level of capital, and it's a history, it's a narrative, but it is also something that is valued overall in the broader gamer subculture, and something that particularly newer gamers recognize that they don't have yet, and they feel inadequate when they don't have those stories to tell.
Yeah, I would also note, Himadri, I was just really struck by when you were talking about trying to find that place where you can make an intervention versus the sort of like overwhelming angst of the world, or like the oncoming army that might be looking to eradicate you at any given moment. Is just such a human moment that you're observing in your research. And I think especially as we've been living in increasingly difficult times, we've all had more moments like that where we reflect and then kind of recede into our hobbies and stuff like that. And I just love that observation. All right, we do have some questions up. So I'm going to start at the top. Cat Wood asks, Stephen, if I recall, you had put out a survey about tabletop RPG players and experiences. Is this concluded, and will it be included in your most recent publication?
It's going to be a separate publication. I'm just starting to analyze those data. I had 840 people respond, and it was a mixed method. So it was some qualitative questioning and some quantitative questioning. In the group on Facebook, role-playing study group, I can't remember what the actual name is, and I'm a moderator, so I should. But anyway, I posted some preliminary data and just showed some of the glaring differences between individuals who define themselves as male, female, or trans. That was evident from the information that I got. And yeah, that's definitely going to be a paper. And once I find a conference, I'm going to be presenting on that before the paper comes out, because yes, it's some really interesting information. Thank you for asking.
Wonderful. Next up, we have Marshall Miller asks, what lessons can students in formal game design studies programs take away from self-taught homebrew game designers? I definitely think this is for Marc and Scott, but if anyone else wants to jump in, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start, and I think Marc will kind of add some thoughts as well after. I think homebrew is a as Marc kind of explained, it's something that's really experimental, it's co-collaborative, and it's not just insular anymore. And so I think it's something that we can actually bring into the classroom more broadly, where you can either look at kind of homebrew practices that they're using to help kind of guide, young homebrewers or new homebrewers who want to get started, kind of through the documentation design that they're doing. But homebrew is also it's not as written down. There's no like hard and fast rules of like what's an acceptable homebrew, because those rules kind of get defined by the audience and the tables you're playing at. And so I think if you kind of take that discourse that homebrew provides and use that in your own teaching programs, there's actually a lot of value for kind of allowing for really creative engagements with existing games that are already out there. So I think that's kind of the main lesson that you can start with like, let's not look at a system as something we have to engage with fully, but how can we adopt the system to meet the needs of us and the audiences we want to engage in? And I'll pass to Marc if he wants to add anything.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that are really good. One is that like, you don't have to stress about code. Like you can start making a lot of macro design decisions and small micro decisions about like fine tuning numbers and stuff when thinking about homebrew, because you're not stressed about the technical details as much. Like they are there, but I think they're much less obvious than if you're doing like video game design, for example. And also there are so many knobs in these compared to, I don't know, standard mass market board games. Wargaming is a different thing, but that I think there's a lot to play with in the TTRPG realm. There's a lot that you can do with it, and that experimental part of it too, I think, is really good. the aspect of like, what does a D&D table look like in terms of size, like a DM and 4 players, 5 players, maybe Stephen mentioned 10 players, right? Of like, you still have this smaller group where you can kind of test out your ideas and hopefully do so without, I don't know, stress from your peers, like the people that you're playing with at the table or designing with at the table. I think that's what makes homebrew appealing to the people we spoke to as well, is like, you get to test stuff out, you get to get it wrong, and it's fine. Like, that's okay, right? That's part of the journey. That's part of the experimental part of this. And I think that's, at least, even if you're not homebrewing a TTRPG or you're trying to redesign a TTRPG, you can certainly take that ethos into your design work. And I think that would probably be a fruitful use of that mindset. Yeah.
Great answers. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? All right, moving on. Danielle Costello asks, Mirek, on archiving, you've talked about how legacy games ephemera. But do you have any thoughts on how to archive the ephemeral nature of play, particularly in some of these games that are so intimate and games that are meant to be burned? Great question.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a super great question. I think yeah, like I was taking a very heavily like, here is evidence, embodied in this sort of physical form. And it just, what are the limitations of what that can tell us, especially just like, I think of the arc of a single game, a Pandemic Legacy, like there's a couple permanent changes at the end of that game, and those are embodied there. But like, what actually happened in there, what led to those, is not really captured there. The first thing that really comes to mind here is like, and this is something that is heavily dependent on, the work of the players themselves. We see, sort of narrativizations of like games, plays on Board Game Geek or something, but we're like, well, here's what happened in my game. It was crazy. Here's the whole arc, this big dramatic moment. These sort of really special moments that happen to people, are not necessarily captured. That could be something that you could maybe design, to try to capture more of that. But given the current games that are out, I think it's maybe more of an interview sort of thing. For example, in Risk Legacy, I was 18 when I played this, and I was, the second to last game, I threw a whole hissy fit, and that's not in there. Thank goodness. But I think that is something that comes to mind very strongly when I think of it. In terms of like the intimacy of it as well, it's like, how much of that can we capture and should we capture, especially for a public archive, and then that's what I'm talking about, this sort of contextual thing. A lot of that stuff, is particular to that microculture. So I think sort of extracting that sort of thing, we have to be careful about that. So thank you. Yeah.
I'm just gonna add one small answer to that also, which is that when we founded Analog Game Studies, we had 3 streams. The first was experimentation and design, which is a design focused stream. The next was like analysis, which was like sort of like essay focused writing. And the third was documentation. And we had a documentation stream because we knew from performance studies, we knew from people who worked on LARP, that things like performances, things like the ephemeral were really hard to kind of track down and pin down. And we thought it was important that people publish about what they were doing so that there could be a resource for people in the future to go back to and look at. So that's another strategy of archiving, but we have a lot more questions coming, so I'm going to keep them going. Anonymous attendee says, when it comes to the archival preservation of legacy games, did I go over this one already? No, very similar question. When it comes to archival presentation of legacy games, what kinds of insights would future historians be able to extract from looking at the final end state of a game? If players could have arrived at the final state from a large number of different possible paths for which there exists no log of moves, what can the final record of that game tell us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a very good question and ties very much into the previous one. I think this sort of intermediary aspect is really not captured like you're supposed to on the back of your like little characters in Pandemic Legacy, like who played this character in which game, what happened to them, a brief description. But I didn't do that. I don't know if other people do that. I don't know if that information is actually there. Right. So I think, yeah, I think, and it's something else I was thinking about is like, it's not necessarily the final state in terms of a finished campaign, because many people start a legacy game, don't finish it because they, can't organize with other people, which I'm sure resonates with the whole tabletop RPG crowd here. But to look at like a half-finished copy of of Pandemic Legacy, do we know how far they got? What sort of information can we get from that? And I think it's quite limited. So, thanks.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. This comes also from Danielle Costello. Himadri, you talked about chess from the movie book being a third choice that gave the protagonist agency outside of the confines of the war around them. Can you talk more on your thoughts about games as creating agency and actors?
Absolutely. This is a fascinating question, and it is at the basis of what I was talking about. Games in themselves are really unique because of their active nature. Like, what sets a game apart from most other forms of media is the fact that you can change the outcome, that you can actively influence what's going on in the game world, as opposed to, say, a book or a film, which is one of the main things that makes a game a game. The form itself carries these implications of agency. But more so in times of, say, political conflict or personal conflict or general tragedy, like the time of COVID-19, games become a way to combat the sense of helplessness that comes with this kind of a time and this kind of a conflict. And so this agency becomes this counter narrative to the lack of options that people see in front of them. And this is also really connected with the more curative sense of games, how games are used in medicine, how games are used in teaching, how games are used to make people feel better. It's not necessarily about, actively changing the problems, but more giving people that sense of control to change their own problems, which I think really resonates with the idea of agency. So yeah, absolutely, it's crucial.
Any other thoughts on this before we move to the next question? All right, moving on. I think this is for Marc and Scott, but it might also apply to Stephen's work. Cass Wilkinson Saldana asks, building off of microcultures, a lot of your work points to the played game that players build and change together through their play. Homebrew, the physical game that changes, gaming in and against context. Open-ended question. What do you find compelling about the relationship between players and designers and how they both see a game?
I'll start, but Stephen, if you feel like you want to add anything here, please feel free to jump in, and Marc as well. For me, the most compelling aspect is actually the various tensions that exist at different tables. So there are some people that we talked about and some tables that we talked about where the designer-player relationship is quite meaningfully interactive. So it's like, tell me what fantasies you want to play, tell me what interactions you want to play, let's homebrew something together. And others are like, I have homebrewed this 500-page world, and you shall sit in it, and you shall play in it, and you shall make a character based off everything I have designed. And I think both can be really meaningful moments, because one is like, especially among friends, times to like share and engage in these very like strongly built narrative spaces, and other times are like, let's work together to kind of make this ridiculous story, and both can turn into really meaningful campaigns and adventures. So for me, it's actually kind of knowing like where the boundaries are for like how much agency players get in their own making versus how much agency kind of the designers or GMs or DMs, whatever term you want to use for them, have in their making process as well. I don't know if Marc or anybody else wants to add anything.
Yeah, I mean the question for me, because like this is one thing that I work on, but generally this is what I do, is I look at the relationship between players and the designers and the objects that they design, right? And there's just so much tension in that space about what a game means to a player, how they're able to make it the thing that they want it to be. Homebrew is, it affords certain there are affordances that video game communities don't have access to, especially when we're talking about online games where they can't modify these as easily. And there's, there are elements of toxicity that develop as a result because the game isn't what the players want it to be, and they can't fix that in any way. They can't change it. They can't modify it. They can maybe play against the grain a little bit, but even in that case, how much can you really, right? And so, I mean, what's compelling about it? I don't know, everything. It's all the good stuff is there, right? But this is one of those spaces where you can see players push back against it on these different scales at the table, trying to get it into the community, seeing the pushback that emerges from that, because some people really do absorb like D&D vanilla as this is what the game is supposed to be, right? And there's I don't know, there's something magical to find there about what we can do to make these things we love to play a bit, I don't know, better for folks who love these games but are left wanting for any number of reasons, right? So yeah, I mean, everything is compelling about that.
There's also an issue of power structure, and not from the point of view of designers or GMs or DMs have different power, but part of Doxa is that there's this assumption that DMs or GMs know how much power they're supposed to have and players understand, but that is such a false equivalence. I mean, there are some people who want a really dominant DM who acts like they're God, and there are some people who want a collaborative DM. And the problem is, because of Doxa, we never have these conversations. So we just deal with some DM or GM that we hate, and we don't realize that we should have had this conversation at some point about, okay, this is what you expect out of me as a player, because I think there's a lot more malleability in the player, but I think that there are options, and that relates to my DM Habitus paper. There are options in how DMs and GMs could act, and we don't necessarily envision those options.
Really great points there. I'm just going to keep on the question flow moving. Michael V. Rosario says, Mirek, it's Mike, one of the shadow box makers. Great talk. It seems like campaign games that use apps to track game campaign state would provide easy access to digitized data. Is this something that researchers are considering tapping? Also, how do you feel about content creators live streaming games as a way of archiving and digitizing gameplay? And although this is directed at Mirek, I would not be surprised if many of you have some great thoughts on this question as well. So anyone after Mirek answers, please jump in.
Great. Hi, Mike. Thank you again for letting me use your picture. Everyone was really stoked about your shadow box, it seems. Anyway, yeah, about the campaign game, like tracking apps, that I think that, you know, as the other stuff I've said in the Q&A, I think that's a nice, elegant solution as something that probably is capturing a lot of the interim information that researchers, I'm now considering. Yes, so thank you for that. I think that's a really great suggestion. I'm curious about, you know, how that information is like stored, whether it's like overridden or if there is like a running log happening. That sort of thing would be interesting. And then as far as the live streaming games, I think that, you know, I think having a video of people playing the game is like, that's very good. That's prime. So I think that would be, everyone do that if you want. I think that would be great. So thank you.
Any other responses to that? All right.
It's not necessarily live streaming, but I'm also thinking about just games being written about and people documenting through writing. And since I do a lot of my research through literature and books, so and often through fiction. So even though it's not fact by fact, turn by turn documentation, I think there is still a lot of value in fiction and writing about games, which carries information and understanding about games and player experience, which we wouldn't know otherwise. So yeah.
I would also add, we're having a conversation in the Discord about it that I'm going to pull to our synchronous sort of conversation, but we're also talking about actual play as like a form of oral history or a form of like documenting our experience of a thing that is not beholden to like, here are the facts and the data of what happened. But I'm also curious about actual play, not as like an entertainment thing and not as like a tool for game designers, but as this sort of way of recording our experience of play that is focused on like, here is the story that I am telling about my experience.
To that end, Andy Phelps and I are presenting a paper at the AOIR talking about the idea of actual play and the issue of, is some actual play designed to essentially be reality television? And if that's the case, then how authentic a narrative is it? And what is the role of playing to the audience versus keeping an authentic story that it has historical and archival value, or at least that's my question.
I think all really great questions. That would be great papers for Generation Analog 24. We've got one last question in the list, and I think that would be a good time to end after that question. Even though we wrote 8 p.m. or I guess 7 p.m. Or 10 p.m. Eastern, that's very late, and we're going to be back tomorrow. So I want to give everybody some time to decompress. But anonymous attendee writes to Percival. Percival made the point that history is not always going to be complete. How much of the fact that privacy and intimacy depend on ephemerality is undermined by a focus on archiving?
That's a really, really good question. And I think the thing that I would say is that, and this feels like wild to say as a person who does research, but like, I think we need to let go, at least in terms of history, about the idea that it will ever be accurate, because it's just not possible. So I think it's more about embracing that there are stories that people will not tell because they want them to be private, or they want them to be ephemeral, or they want them to not be recorded, and sort of finding peace with that, but also thinking about the way that genealogy, the way that Foucault talks about it, like splits history into here are all of the stories we might tell about this thing in a way that undermines our ability to be certain about any of it. And I think there's room within embracing here are the plethora of stories we might, here are the plethora of ways we might narrate this for privacy and intimacy and for all of these sort of different perspectives. But it also requires us to sort of be okay with the fact that we just like, it just isn't, it will be true to us, but it will not be true objectively, and objective truth is just not a thing in this particular case. Which is it's almost 10 p.m. Not very good answer to that question.
No, it was actually an excellent answer, and but I'm happy to hear other answers if people have them to that question, because I think it is one that asks for many answers. But I'm also happy to let everybody just go to bed. So counting down 3, 2, 1. All right, so let's leave it on that point. It has been a great day for Generation Analog 23. Thank you all for coming out. I think the energy has just been flowing all day in the Discord and on the talks and stuff, and I can't wait to get back to it tomorrow. It's always a good conference when you feel like things are happening that you can't keep track of, and I definitely feel that way right now about all the things that have happened today. And so even though this is a single stream and online, there are clearly side conversations happening in rooms that we can't be surveilling simultaneously, and this is a very good thing. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for bringing your A game and all these wonderful questions, insights, and generosity to the conference. And we're going to see you bright and early tomorrow morning at, what is it, 9 something Eastern time, 9:45? 9:45 Eastern time. So you'll have a little more time to sleep in if you're out here on the West Coast. Anyways,
it's a different link, right?
I believe it's the same link.
Okay.
I believe it's the same link. It should just be programmed for one big day. Anyways, if it is a different link, we will know, and we will get back to you and let you know about the link situation that's going on. But I do think it's the same link. So we'll see you all here tomorrow, and we're looking forward to it. So bye, everybody.